he has been delayed, but he'll be here any moment. Additionally, Mr. Smith, we will be working with Ranking Member Susan Davis of California. But we would like to thank everyone for being here today. The hearing today is certainly very important, and the issues that are being discussed are critically important. And working with our allies to increase global security is an important mission for the U.S. military, rightfully so, as we have never faced with a more complex or complicated array of threats to America's security. In addition, tight defense budgets put additional pressure on many of the accounts from which security assistance is drawn. For these reasons and others, the committee has dedicated this week for oversight of the Department of Defense security cooperation activities, programs, and authorities. This week, the committee's activities include a background briefing by Congressional Research Service, this opening hearing with outside witnesses, and a classified briefing with officials from both DOD and Department of State on the status of the administration's efforts. There's general agreement that security cooperation should be an important component of our national security strategy. It creates more capable fighting partners and builds relationships that promote U.S. security interest. But we need to remember what it means, not as an end. We've seen cases where security cooperation has been successful. For example, countering narcotics traffickers in the nation of Colombia, or training Eastern European forces before they deploy to Afghanistan. We've also seen failures with the Iraq and Syria train and equip programs, the most notable, sadly, recent examples. Through this week-long review of security cooperation efforts, we hope to ask and answer a number of critical questions. What makes a program successful? And what can we learn from the failures? During today's hearing, we will look into our distinguished panel of experts to help us analyze the lessons learned, what works and what doesn't, so what the tool of security cooperation is used in the right way to ensure that future programs are set up for success. Helping others develop the capability to do things that need to be done makes sense. And part of the reason DOD is doing more of it is because they actually get it done, and particularly in the case of counterterrorism, get it done in a timely way. Security Cooperation Week, combined with the language of the National Defense Authorization Act, requiring the DOD to submit a strategic framework for building partnership capacity to Congress, are the first steps by the committee as part of a long-term effort to review the use and effectiveness of security cooperation programs. In fact, this year, the National Defense Authorization Act includes important provisions to help improve our security cooperation efforts, such as the requirement for the Security Cooperation Framework and a couple of new authorities. I would like to make a final point about working with friends and allies beyond building partnership capacity and other security cooperation. The House and Senate have sent the President a National Defense Authorization Act that passed both chambers with strong bipartisan majorities. The legislation is a result of months of collaboration across the aisle, people working together to support our troops, making critical reforms to acquisition and military retirement to ensure the country is more secure. Wouldn't it send a strong signal to the country, to our partners and friends, and to the rest of the world, that the U.S. Congress and our President are pulling in the same direction when it comes to global security? With that said, I turn to our ranking member who has arrived for any opening comments he would like to make. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this hearing. I think this is an incredibly important topic, building partner capacity, because there are just certain realities in the world right now. In the U.S. military is not going to be able to go any place in the world and fix problems on its own. We need allies, we need friends, we need partners in order to multiply, be a force multiplier, basically, to enable us to be successful in parts of the world where we have unquestioned national security interests, but where the U.S. military simply showing up is not necessarily going to fix the problem. So I think it's an incredibly important part of what we do. And now, it hasn't always been successful. And I think a lot of folks have, criticized some of those failures, some of those areas where it didn't work. And my great fear is that will be used as an excuse to say that we shouldn't do this, when we cannot succeed in the current national security environment unless we build partner capacity, unless we use allies to help us succeed, help us achieve our national security goals. Critically important. And then, couple areas where I think we've been very successful at this in the Horn of Africa, in dealing with Somalia and Al-Shabaab and AQAP, with a very, very light U.S. footprint. The exact number of U.S. troops involved is classified, but it's triple digits, not quadruple, four. And the reason we've been successful there is we've worked with Ethiopia, we've worked with Kenya, we've worked with Uganda, we've worked with Burundi. We have helped build their capacity, and we've been able to contain a threat. Now, it's not, a 100% peaceful, rosy scenario, but it certainly hasn't spun out of control, and we've had no attacks against U.S. Western targets come out of Al-Shabaab and Somalia because we built that partner capacity and because we were able to successfully partner. And I think that is just critically important. Also in the Philippines, with a relatively light footprint, we've worked with the Philippine government to contain insurgencies in the southern islands in the Philippines. Again, not a 100% success. There are still challenges down there, but we have built the capacity of the Philippine military to deal with that problem rather than sending in tens of thousands of U.S. troops. And I think that's going to be the model going forward, finding partners that we can work with to contain these threats. We have that challenge now in northern Africa, in Mali, elsewhere, finding those partners. But in that case, we've worked to some degree with some of our European partners, like the French, who have better connections, better relationships down there. We still have a long way to go, obviously, with the chaos coming out of Libya. But I think building that partner capacity and finding allies that can help us is a critical piece of it. The final thing that I would add is that partner capacity sort of includes the Department of Defense building its partner capacity with our other two elements of national security, diplomacy and development. And that's areas where I think we can better coordinate. I've been to dozens of countries where this has been tried, and in some places it works and in some places it doesn't. And I think one of the big factors is how well the State Department gets along with the Department of Defense in those areas. In some cases, you have ambassadors who have great partnerships with the Department of Defense. In other cases, they're going at each other all the time and always in disagreement about how to proceed and who exactly is in charge. Building up the level of cooperation between the State Department and the Department of Defense is very important. And I would also say that building up development capacity. And when I was in the Philippines, there was a great project, and there we had an ambassador who worked very closely with our local special operations commander at the time, and also worked very well with USAID. Went to one of the southern islands for when they were cutting the ribbon on a new school that they had built. And that partnership on our side between defense, development, and diplomacy is the building block to successfully build the partnerships with the local countries where we are working and to build their capacity. So that has to be part of it as well. With that, I look forward to testimony and questions from the members. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And we now want to welcome our witnesses for the purpose of this hearing, which is examining Department of Defense security cooperation, when it works and when it doesn't. We're very grateful to have three distinguished witnesses with us today. Dr. Derek Revon, PhD, Professor of National Security Affairs of U.S. Naval War College. Dr. Christopher Paul, who is, again, PhD, a Senior Special Scientist of the RAND Corporation, and also General Douglas Frasier, U.S. Air Force retired, Principal of the Douglas Frasier LLC, and former Southcom Commander and former PACOM Deputy Commander. Each of you, we're really grateful for your participation today, and we will begin with Dr. Revon, and then we'll proceed down the dais.
No, thank you very much, and good morning. It's an honor to speak to the committee today about security cooperation. The ideas are my own and largely reflect my work in my book, Exporting Security. Security cooperation is not an abstract concept to me, but something I participated in firsthand as an academic and as a naval officer. My study began in the late 1990s when I observed military diplomacy firsthand and continued through the last decade working with security assistance officers around the world to include dozens of militaries, Iraq and Afghanistan included. Additionally, my students at the Naval War College have been very helpful in my thinking on this. During this time, there has been no shortage of foreign policy crises. In an effort to reach for peace, the U.S. seeks to prevent conflict by helping regimes through security cooperation, which includes all Department of Defense interactions with foreign defense establishments. By sending weapons, trainers, and advisors, the U.S. helps other countries meet their national security that is challenged by intrastate, transnational, and regional challengers. Security cooperation is much bigger than building partnership capacity in combat zones. It seeks to empower U.S. partners rather than address security challenges through American force alone. Since coalition operations are a norm, security cooperation also ensures partners are interoperable with U.S. forces. For example, in Afghanistan, we operated with 50 partners who brought capabilities that we could not, such as police training. In Bahrain, a U.S. officer today directs 3 naval task forces composed of 30 partners who collectively protect vital trade routes. And in Key West, Joint Interagency Task Force South serves as a fusion center supporting international efforts to eliminate illicit trafficking in the Caribbean and Latin America. Security cooperation enables these coalitions to work. The programs ensure partners have access to the U.S. defense industrial base, and U.S.-sponsored military exercises promote interoperability. Known as the indirect approach, the U.S. helps countries fill security deficits that exist when a country cannot independently protect its own national security. American generosity helps explain this, but U.S. national security benefits too. For example, by providing radars and surveillance technology, Central American countries can control their airspace and can interdict drug-filled planes bound for the United States. By providing logistics support, Pakistan can lead a coalition promoting maritime security in the Indian Ocean. And by selling Aegis destroyers, Japan can counter North Korean missiles and provide early warning of missile threats to the United States. The rationale for security cooperation has been based on the assumption that instability breeds chaos, which would make it more likely that the U.S. or the international community would face pressure in the future to intervene. Given America's global foreign policy, many countries have large expectations for assistance from the United States. But the U.S. also derives benefits from security cooperation. Among these are obtaining base access as a quid pro quo, augmenting U.S. force structure by providing logistics and intelligence support to coalition partners in the Middle East, promoting a favorable balance of power by selling weapon systems and training programs to Gulf Cooperation Council countries to balance Iran, harmonizing areas of cooperation by working with Japan and Israel on missile defense, promoting self-defense through the Georgia Train and Equip program, reinforcing sovereignty like programs such as the Merida Initiative with Mexico, and supporting the U.S. industrial base and creating interoperable air forces through the F-35 program. At times, security cooperation can be limitless, dissatisfying, and futile. Further, risks abound. First, the non-exclusive nature of these activities will produce more failures than successes, which negatively impacts confidence in security cooperation as a tool. Second, the personnel system is not producing sufficient talent to support these missions. American forces no longer operate in isolation and need an appreciation of the historical, cultural, and political context of where they operate. Third, there is a tendency to over-rely on partners, thinking they can accomplish U.S. objectives when they either lack the political motivation or the skills to do so. Without indigenous political legitimacy, programs can only have a marginal impact on a country's security and stability. Finally, other countries will rely on the U.S. to subsidize their own defense budgets, creating a free rider problem. Given the disappointments in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, there is a potential for the value of security cooperation to be ignored. But these programs are not confined to combat zones alone. When thinking about security cooperation, we should look at how international partners contribute to coalition operations, peacekeeping, and global security. U.S. budgetary declines will likely reinforce the importance of security cooperation, as the U.S. will need more partners and allies to augment its own defense capacities. I hope this hearing can show those inside and outside of the government of the challenges of the by, with, and through partners approach, why security cooperation is an important pillar of U.S. defense strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Revon. We now proceed to Dr. Paul.
Thank you for inviting me here to testify today. My remarks today will draw on research on security cooperation that I've led at RAND over the last several years. In one study, we used detailed case studies of 29 countries over 20 years. In a follow-on study, we did deep dive case studies of 4 countries chosen specifically because they highlighted a range of possible challenges. Our research has found several factors that are critical contributors in security cooperation. I'll review them. First, matching matters. Efforts to build partner capacity are most effective when what is being offered aligns well with partner nations' forces' baseline capabilities and with their ability to absorb training and technology. Second, relationships matter, and they can take time to establish. Relationships contribute a necessary level of trust and understanding, and relationships also include the alignment of objectives between the United States and the partner. Third, context matters. Certain characteristics or features of partners improve their prospects for success. Specifically, partners with relatively robust governance and relatively strong economies have historically had more success in this area. Having a functioning Ministry of Defense and having sufficient resources and willingness to invest in sustainment are also helpful. Fourth, consistency and sustainment are key. By sustainment, I mean the provision of logistics and personnel services necessary to keep something going. That includes maintenance, spare and replacement parts, and some kind of plans for manning and personnel sustainment. In historical cases in which the United States provided consistent funding and effort over several years, and some kind of sustainment effort was in place, be it provided by the U.S. or the partner, capacity was much more likely to be built and maintained. While our research highlighted several elements conducive to security cooperation success, we've also highlighted various challenges that can reduce prospect for success. I'll list some of them. First among them is partner willingness. One of the findings of our research is that you can't want it more than they do. Lack of willingness can disrupt security cooperation at many different levels, any of which can result in delay, diminished success, or outright failure. Examples include partners who are unwilling to participate in security cooperation activities, partners willing to participate but unwilling to focus their efforts in areas of interest to the United States, and partners unwilling to use the capacity that has been built for the purpose that it was intended. We found that many of the challenges to security cooperation success stem from shortcoming in U.S. practices. Specifically, the U.S. funds and delivers security cooperation inconsistently, and that decreases effectiveness. Inadequate sustainment planning hurts security cooperation effectiveness too. As noted, unless they're sustained, forces and capabilities rapidly atrophy. Similarly, a lack of flexibility in security cooperation is a constraint on effectiveness. The administrative requirements lack needed flexibility. And these last 3 problems stem in part from some weaknesses in the legislative authorities. While the patchwork of authorities available to fund and support security cooperation enable a wide range of activities, they rarely support an activity for more than a year or 2, resulting in uncertainty about continuation. They also leave insufficient room for flexibility. To support progress in this area, I'll highlight 5 recommendations. First, reform legislative authorities to improve flexibility and simplify procedures. Second, revise or add new authorities to support a wider range of activities over longer periods of time and sustain them. This may entail new needed authorities, specifically to add a sustainment tail to existing programs and authorities. Third, consider whether partners have the attributes or characteristics that are associated with effective security cooperation. Use the results of that consideration to manage expectations accordingly. Fourth, regardless of the partner or context, review how well security cooperation goals and activities correspond with what the partner wants or needs, and what that partner is capable of using and absorbing. As we've noted elsewhere, security cooperation must find the right ladder, find the right rung when aligning activities for partners. Fifth and finally, emphasize sustainment when reviewing security cooperation programs, and ask whether planners have identified means at the outset for the sustainment and maintenance of any capabilities to be built. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul. We now proceed to General Frasier.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, it's been over 3 years since I last had the opportunity to be up here before you. I'm honored to be here again, this time out of uniform, to share my perspective on the value of security cooperation programs and what they provide the Department of Defense in our nation. It's also a pleasure for me to share this table with such two distinguished scholars in Professor Revon and Dr. Paul. My comments today are based on my experience planning and executing security cooperation programs in two separate geographic combatant commands, U.S. Pacific Command and United States Southern Command. According to the U.S. National Security Strategy, maintaining the security, confidence, and reliabilities of our allies is one of the key national security interests of the United States. Department of Defense security cooperation programs provide the tools that enable the services to support this national security interest. Increasingly, international security threats require a coalition of nations to counter and defeat them. To this end, the Armed Forces of the United States routinely trains with partner nations to be ready to form and fight a coalition when called. Department of Defense cooperation programs enable this training. Therefore, Department of Defense security programs provide three valuable contributions to the security of the United States. First, they build important relationships between the members of the armed forces of the U.S. and our partner nations, which in turn enhance their capability to form and fight as a coalition in times of crisis. In conjunction with the Department of State security assistance programs, security cooperation programs help build the capacity of partner nation armed forces to maintain security within their borders. And third, these programs grow the professional understanding of partner militaries on the importance of adhering to international standards of conduct, to include respect for human rights, the rule of law, and the role of elected civilian authorities. On the flip side, we think that security cooperation programs can accomplish more than they are designed to do. Therefore, let me mention what I think security cooperation programs cannot do. First, they cannot prevent political change in a nation. Security cooperation programs encourage the armed forces of our partner nations to support the democratic process and defend the rights of their citizens to decide their political future. In maintaining these standards, political change can happen that does not support U.S. interests. And second, security cooperation programs will not significantly reduce the breeding grounds of conflict, poverty, income inequality, or poor social infrastructure. Mr. Chairman, while this hearing is focused on security cooperation, because the responsibility for helping partner militaries resides in both defense and state, I think it's important to acknowledge the close relationship that exists between the Department of Defense security cooperation programs and Department of State security assistance programs. The training and exercise programs conducted under security cooperation mesh closely with the education and equipping programs conducted through security assistance programs. And in my experience in working in two combatant commands, the relationships, as Congressman Smith said, between the Department of State and the Department of Defense is very close and really works closely to manage and maintain those capabilities. By supporting each other, these programs actually increase the success for both. Finally, security cooperation programs are important for the defense of the United States. We live in a globalized world. The United States will increasingly rely on our partners to help maintain peace and security around the world. As I said earlier, security cooperation programs play a key role in enabling the U.S. and our partners to train and fight together. I'm concerned that declining budgets will have a disproportionate impact on these programs, cutting them to a higher degree than other defense programs and thereby reducing their effectiveness. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you. I look forward to your questions.
Well, let me thank you all for being here, and I apologize for being a little late, but I very much appreciate y'all's testimony. I'm going to yield my 5 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, who I appreciate filling in for me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here And I appreciate there was a reference to Colombia. This, people only hear really the negative. But Plan Colombia has been a success. I'm really grateful that I've had the opportunity to serve along with my wife as the co-chair of the Partners of the Americas Program Association of our state, South Carolina, with Colombia. So I've had the opportunity to visit the country, an extraordinary country of 40 million people. Also, two of my sons actually were exchange students at a high school in Cali. And then we've had students come and live with us as exchange students. And we've seen transition from a circumstance of narco-terrorists controlling extensive areas of the country and thousands of lives being lost to Colombian families being protected. And I wish more people in the United States knew of the success of the cooperation between the United States and the people of Colombia. With that in mind, for each of you, what factors should we use to evaluate how well security cooperation activities are having with their intended effects, beginning with Dr. Revon? Professor.
No, thank you, sir. I think as we start thinking about success, just to reiterate what my colleague said, first is the alignment of national interests is essential. And in your case that we highlight Colombia, I might add a couple points and then certainly defer to General Frasier. First, I thought what Congress did was limit the number of uniformed personnel that could be inside Colombia. I think initially it was 400 and then increased to 800. I think that had a very positive effect. One, it really sent the message to the Colombians that it's their fight and we're here to help in terms of enable through planning, logistics, and then some critical missing capabilities such as rotary wing. Second, it related to that is really the absorption capacity. How well a partner can absorb U.S. aid. Sometimes we tend to treat other militaries as equal to our own, and I think in a professional setting that of course is the right way to approach it, but when we start looking at training and absorption capacity, we sometimes get the standard wrong. And so as I think about success and non-success, it's really, I ask the question, to what standard? Should we be training partners to the U.S. standard, to the NATO standard, or to some other standard? And finally, in terms of success, I think these are U.S. government programs, and in my own experience, I find they work best when they're coordinated at the U.S. Embassy level. And my favorite quote, I can't name, but a combatant commander described himself or herself as the 4-star, but when meeting with the U.S. ambassador, that's the 5-star. And when we see good bureaucratic alignment inside the U.S. government and programs driven at the country level, I think we tend to see greater success.
Thank you. I actually have a third report that addresses assessments and evaluation explicitly, but I'll make just a few points from it. I think when we're looking for criteria to evaluate success in security cooperation, it depends in large part on what we set out to do and how well we've specified that. One of the broader recommendations of my research and that of others is that objectives be specified in a way that is SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, both short-term intermediate objectives for individual programs and program years and long-term objectives and strategies. I think Colombia is a very interesting example because part of the story of Colombia is how it took time for the security cooperation relationship to mature and evolve. There was initially a mismatch in objectives. The United States was primarily concerned with drugs. The Colombians were primarily concerned with international security. And so because of that mismatch, there was often ineffective action. But as the relationship evolved, and especially after 9/11, when our focus changed, that relationship became much more effective, and the security cooperation did as well.
Thank you, Congressman Wilson. I guess I've put mine into three different categories. One is strategic patience. And I think security cooperation programs require strategic patience. Plan Colombia happened, but the United States had been working with the Colombian government, the Colombian Armed Forces, for 20 to 30 years prior to that, helping build the institutions within Colombia to be successful. Primarily the military, with some corollary in coordination with the Department of State with the police. And so when Plan Colombia was put in place, the conditions were right in the country to help do that. So strategic patience, I think, is important. a commitment also. And at the time that Plan Colombia happened, there was a lot of things came together in Colombia, and a lot of focus came together in the United States also, and we had a common commitment. Although, as Dr. Paul says, I think we were misaligned there. And going back to the earlier point of authorities, we had a misalignment of authorities. Our objectives were counter-drug, and we limited the use of the capabilities that we were supporting the Colombians with to that mission. When there was an intertwined problem within Colombia of counterterrorism as well as counter-drug. And when we've changed those authorities was when the support of the United States really helped make a difference in key areas for the support of Colombia. But I also think it's important to remember that while the United States support was very helpful and made a difference, it was really the Colombians who won Colombia's struggle.
Thank you.
Ms. Smith.
Yeah, it's two questions. How important is development policy to the partner capacity issues that we're talking about in building those partnerships? And how can we improve the U.S. in terms of our development policy? Personally, I think it can be very important. I don't think we have the best, most coordinated development structure. But as you've gone in these places and tried to build that partner capacity, obviously, we have the military training component. We have the State Department diplomacy. You know, whether you're talking about Colombia or, as I talked about, the Philippines or the Horn of Africa, where does the development piece fit into this building partner capacity?
Congressman, let me start. From my standpoint, they have to be very much linked. In many cases, when I don't think security cooperation and our security overall foreign assistance isn't working well, it's when they are all working their own problems and where they see the problems as the most need, but they don't fit together in the overall capacity of where the strategic direction of the country is. Colombia, going back to that example, was successful because the Colombians actually put together a very coordinated strategic plan of how they were going to move from one part of the country to another, gain secure locations in one part of the country, and then bring in the development programs to help secure that area while they maintain the security within the country. In other parts of the region, and I'll use Central America as an example, our efforts at times are very uncoordinated as they're applied at the tactical level in a country. So it's misapplied and it's not necessarily well aligned within those countries. So it is that discussion, I think, between all the areas of foreign assistance that we have that conversation to really align those projects. And I think overall strategy of foreign assistance as it applies to the country matters also. And it's applied inconsistently or it varies by embassy on how it's applied. So the roles of ambassadors are critically important.
I think that how important development policy is depends in part on our objectives. But within that, development is clearly tied to absorptive capacity, clearly tied to ministerial capacity, and clearly tied to the partner nation's focus. So to the extent that our objectives rely on those things, and those things are all correlated with success in security cooperation, it becomes important. As to what we can do to improve our development policy, that's not my area of expertise, so I'll defer to the other gentleman on the panel.
I won't take that last part, but I think your question is very good because it also goes to the pace. And so as we think about the 3D approach, defense, development, and diplomacy, the pace is very different. And so the example I like is the military can build a school pretty quickly, but it needs the Department of State to say where the school should be built, but it needs AID to train the teachers and provide the school supplies. And if we keep going back to the Colombia case, we could point out they took reclaimed a pretty big part of territory held by the FARC relatively quickly, but then that created the development challenge because then where the local farmers were growing coca, encouraged for crop substitution, there was no transportation system for them to get that out, the legitimate crops out. And so that created a problem. And so sometimes with the pace, the military can go in pretty quickly and maybe establish security in months, where development can take decades.
Yeah, That's absolutely true. As far as how we reform development policy, I think, the best thing we could do is centralize it. Development policy in the U.S. is spread out amongst way too many agencies. I mean, you think of USAID as being in charge of development policy, but they only control about 14% of the development dollars that are spent by the U.S. I mean, it's a patchwork, but that's another discussion. Just a quick question about Afghanistan. I thought something you said about Colombia was really important, that capping the number of troops in Colombia was an important part of the success because it made the Colombians aware that we would help, but it was their fight. And I'm just wondering, General Frasier, if you, now that you're retired, speak frankly and clearly about, this has been a great debate in Afghanistan. It was the debate in Iraq, too, for that matter, is, well, we can't possibly maintain the security environment because our troops are better than theirs. We need more U.S. troops. And I think every military commander's first instinct is to say, give me another 30,000 troops and I can save this situation. When in fact, I think that the opposite tends to be the case. And in Afghanistan, I think that is critically important. And though we certainly have struggles in Afghanistan, you've seen the military and even the police in Afghanistan become much more capable in the last several years as we've drawn down. Now, it's a balance. You didn't say cap Colombia at 50 troops. There has to be a certain level where we can train and meet certain missions. But I'm wondering if you could apply that logic to Afghanistan and where you see appropriate troop levels to be sufficiently supportive, but also to make it clear that it is the Afghans' fight.
I'm going to
Punt?
give you a little bit of a coordinated, because my expertise is not in Afghanistan.
Okay.
And so the first thing I'll tell you is what happened in Colombia has a model, but it cannot apply specifically to Afghanistan. It's a completely different culture, completely different terrain, has differing issues that they're dealing with. And so to apply them and use that as a comparison, I think it's unfair.
Understood. But the basic principle of too much U.S. presence creates dependency instead of a sustainable situation. Are you saying that they're so different that doesn't even apply?
Sir, I think it needs to be applied to the situation that you find within Afghanistan. And I'm not smart enough on that or learned enough to be able to tell you that question.
I'd be happy to speak to this because I've actually done other research on reaching negotiated settlements, which is, I think, optimistically the outcome that we're hoping for in Afghanistan at this point.
It's a piece of it, yes.
Yeah. So I think your observation that making it clear that it's the Afghans' fight is absolutely central in this. In our research on negotiated settlements, the first step of 7 steps towards achieving negotiated settlement is the perception of stalemate. And stalemate is not just a military reality, it's a perception. And as long as the opposition in Afghanistan perceives that the U.S. is the reason there is a stalemate, then that may slow those perceptions. Because the classic statement from the Afghan perspective is the Americans have all the watches, but we have all the time. So the opposition is waiting for the coalition forces to withdraw so they get a chance to fight just the Afghans and see how well Afghanistan security forces will fight. If when that happens there's a stalemate, then we're well on the path towards settlement.
But we have to get to that point. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And gentlemen, thank you for being here and sharing your expertise in areas of the world that many of us are not that familiar with. And probably, Dr. Paul, because of your expertise, I'll start with you. Many of us in the Congress are very concerned about the continued spending of billions and billions and billions of dollars and not being able to show the taxpayer, talking about Afghanistan now, how they're benefiting or how we are helping to improve the life, if you will, of people in Afghanistan. An article on January 29th of 2014, and the title is this: U.S. Literacy Program for Afghan Military Comes Up Short. These are comments from John Sopka. I'll be very brief. But as of February 2013, roughly half the Afghan forces were still illiterate, despite the Pentagon's expenditures of hundreds of millions of dollars on a literacy program there. according to the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, John Sopko, an independent auditor. Then one other sentence. Moreover, the United States military stated goal of 100% of first grade literacy for the entire force by December 31st of 2014 is probably unattainable. Now, the reason I wanted to ask this question, because we have in our military, most, if not all, that go into the military are high school graduates, okay? Then if we are trying to build the Afghan security forces, we've been there for 14 years, I believe, and we're going to be there another 8 years. That's 22 years. What level in 22 years would you anticipate we could get that Afghan who maybe is not even at the first grade level now? What would be your projections as to where he or she might be in 22 years? I mean, this is where General Frasier was saying declining budgets. They are declining left and right quickly. We're going to raise the debt ceiling in just a few days and spend more and more money over in foreign countries that we can't even account for. And this is what's frustrating the American people. And quite frankly, that's why Donald Trump is getting these big crowds. So Dr. Paul, and one of my dearest friends, by the way, is Ron Paul. I don't know if y'all ken or not, but he's one of my dearest friends. Would you respond to this concern about trying to train people to be able to fight and carry weapons and to do the things that need to be done to build a security force when they can't read at first grade level? And it doesn't seem to be making a heck of a lot of progress. Please share your thoughts with me on that.
That's a great question, sir, and I have a lot of relevant thoughts, so please be patient with me. First, the kernel of that latter issue is about absorptive capacity, and that's a really rough baseline to take Afghan provincial tribesmen who have very low baseline literacy and any kind of education. So what your goals are has to align to that. Is it feasible? Is it really necessary to achieve desired end states? How many people do you really need to educate to what level? And let's look at the history of Afghanistan. A lot of Afghans have been fighting very effectively for a very long time without being literate. So some of that's a product of mirror imaging, that if we imagine that we want them to have conventional, mature, professional forces like our own, that of course to have a force like the United States' force, you need a high level of baseline literacy. That probably isn't feasible in Afghanistan. But sir, your broader question about what do we tell the American people, how do we account for the money spent and what we have to show for it, that is fundamentally an assessment and evaluation question. And if we were doing more and better assessment and evaluation, we would have something to show for them. All of this, a subtext to all of this, is the chain of logic connecting the things that we are doing with how we think they are going to work, with how that's going to get to our end state. And a well-designed assessment framework considers the whole progress along that path, from the SMART objectives at the end, from the SMART intermediate objectives that lead and connect those paths. Assessment and evaluation can be used to ask questions when you're planning operations and efforts. Formative research. How is what I'm planning to do likely to turn out? Assessment and evaluation can be asked of efforts in process. How is this effort going? Am I delivering the products and services and training that I planned to? How is that going? And then, of course, assessment at the back end. When you're done with an effort, how well did it go? Was attendance at the level that was expected? Did the number of trainees that actually passed the course reach our target or not? So that as you continue to move on, you can revise and improve. So assessment supports planning, it supports process improvement, and it enables accountability.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for being here. Nice to see you, General Frasier, as well. Yesterday, we met with the Congressional Research Service, and I think some of the folks are here now. And in some ways, this follows with my colleague's question and adds to, one of my questions has always been, what about State Department capacity? Do they have the capacity that's needed to do what needs to be done, essentially? And one of the issues that was raised yesterday, which has been, I've heard this ever since I've practically been here after 9/11, is that the State Department doesn't have a bench. a wide enough bench, a deep enough bench, as does the military, to provide people to be together in initial planning. And I think some of the questions raised by the answer just now are what skill sets are needed to assess these things. Do people need to be embedded in a situation in order to really, truly evaluate what's happening rather than always being brought in at the end? So how do we obviously have a budget problem, and this committee is not charged with having to budget the State Department. But at the same time, this is just such a recurring theme. And how do we get our hands around this? Is that the problem, or do you think they do have the capacity and that maybe it's within other departments? It's not just the State Department and the military. It's commerce. It's Treasury. It's a whole host of things.
Well, good to see you again, Congressman Davis. Thank you. From my standpoint, the State Department is not resourced well enough. And if you look across the board at all our foreign assistance, depending on what we want that foreign assistance to accomplish, we have to resource it accordingly. And that goes not just to the State Department, but that goes to many of the other agencies who provide foreign assistance throughout the country. And if I look back at General Kelly's last posture statement from Southcom, his comment was he couldn't do what he's doing without the teamwork of everybody else in the federal government who is working this. So I think this overall is, as the NDA this year has put in a requirement for the Department of Defense to come back and give a strategy on security cooperation, I think there needs to be, the Congress would be well served by bringing multiple committees together and developing a strategy of foreign assistance.
Foreign assistance strategy particularly, yeah.
Yeah, I would concur. State Department's role is absolutely critical, and State Department is woefully undermanned. I routinely point out to colleagues in the Department of Defense and in the military services that Department of State has fewer than 1,000 deployable officer equivalents, and that kind of helps them understand the manning mismatch.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to comment?
I think it works, all this works best when there's great cooperation, and state doesn't seem to have the personnel to be able to do this, but the cooperation is essential.
Mm-hmm. Are there instances where you could see the need to have more professional skill sets available to do these evaluations and assessment? I mean, where do we look for that? I know that we have people who have gained some expertise in this area, but to what extent are they really activated in these areas today, and what would you change?
Evaluation isn't as hard as we often think it is, so if we provided more personnel with some basic evaluation training, they could do a better job. One of the big threats to effective evaluation is continuity, and often we see situations because of rotations, both on the military and on the civilian side, that some evaluation or assessment framework is in place, but then the next person in the job recognizes some deficiencies in that framework and starts a new one. So we need to inculcate a culture that says even mediocre evaluation done consistently is better than starting the baseline and starting evaluation over and over again. But there's certainly opportunity to bring in civilian experts and to identify positions both in defense and on the civilian side specifically for assessment and evaluation with possible considerable benefits.
Mm-hmm. Do you, General?
Ma'am, I'd just add one other thing, and that is with declining budgets, I think we have to focus very much on where we want foreign assistance to be successful and why. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be cooperation efforts undertaken with a bunch of different countries, because I think maintaining relationships is an important outcome of security cooperation and foreign assistance.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Frasier, your last comment with declining budgets, we have to figure out where and why. I appreciate that, and that's something that's been one of my big concerns since I've been on this committee and watching the funding for the U.S. military and the number of men and women in uniform. And I look at the world, and Africa's 50-plus countries with 1 billion people. We're talking about Latin America today, 20 or better countries with 600 million in population, and certainly seems to me like we get more bang for our buck, if you will, in the Latin America and Central America countries with our partnerships there. So to me, building that partnership capacity is the key to the U.S.'s ability to influence things in the right direction. And certainly you've been a big part of that. So how would you rate the progress we've made in building the partnership capacity in Latin America? And where do you think we can best spend our dollars to improve those partnership capabilities?
Congressman, thank you for that question. I would say that it's been episodic. At some points we have success when we continue, and as you heard earlier, and those efforts are sustained. But they need to be focused, they need to be sustained, they need to have clear objectives that can happen in 3 to 5 years, and I would argue that's not the long-term objective. That's a stepping stone to a long-term objective. So in support of Latin America, what happened in Colombia, which everybody uses as an example, took a long time to happen, but it got very focused, and it was very much a U.S. government effort supporting a Colombian government effort, both of them working together, and it had strong leadership on both sides of that coin. I think that remains a critical part. Where should we spend that effort right now within Latin America? I think what General Carrolley, the State Department, is doing and focusing in the northern tier of Central America is the right place to continue to focus our efforts. But we need to maintain those relationships with other parts of the region as well.
Schools like WINSEC, the Western Hemisphere School for Security Cooperation, that helps build those military relationships with the future military leaders or current military leaders, really, of these other countries, seems to be a cost-effective model. Is that something that we could extend to other regions of the world, or is that a scenario under which cultural differences would create problems?
No, sir. I think in many cases, I think we already have those schools in many places. They're different names. For example, the Hawaii, the Pacific Command has the Asia Pacific Center for Strategic Studies. Similar school, similar types of programs focused in the same area. So I think a lot of those schools are already in existence. The real focus from my standpoint is they need to be continued to be funded.
Okay, and are we bringing those men and women from other countries to the U.S. to train them in those schools as we do at WINSEC, or?
The Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies is in Hawaii. It's in Honolulu. I can't answer for the other combatant commands.
No, that's great. Thank you. I was not aware of that. Might be a good place for a CODEL. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remainder of my time, but gentlemen, thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm worried that 2 topics have not been explored. One is the very nature of security cooperation is it's usually way more lucrative for the receiving nation. That's where the big money is, right? And I don't want to exaggerate that, but we've already heard some discussion of how meager State Department resources are. And General Frasier mentioned that one general with 4 stars was kind enough to refer to the ambassador as being the 5-star. But that 5-star ambassador had no transportation, no bank account, no resources. So it sounds more like brown-nosing than a genuine compliment. So to what extent in your analysis, and I know it's difficult to generalize, and we should be country-specific, we should be implementation plan-specific, but in general, security cooperation is almost a host country stimulus program compared to what the State Department can offer, right?
No, sir. I would say it's a part of it. Promoting international security, I think, is a key dimension of U.S. foreign policy. The partner certainly benefits. I think benefits that come back to the United States. I like there's currently 3 maritime coalitions operating out of Bahrain. Not one is led by an American anymore, but the United States provides that backbone and lets 3 countries lead these efforts, and I think we benefit in that perspective. The other example that I like is when I was in Afghanistan, we had Mongolians guarding our base. And so we felt we were able to gain that benefit, and we also didn't need 200 U.S. soldiers to guard our base because the
I
Mongolians.
don't think you're really getting my point. The scale of the resources offered, whether in cash or in kind, are just amazing. Like it was our base and some others are guarding it, or it was our flotilla and some others are leading it. But this is amazing. Just transportation around Africa can really only be offered by AFRICOM. The State Department doesn't have its own fleet of planes. So just in terms of scale, I think it's important in your analysis to emphasize scale. And if I were a receiving country, hey, I'd go where the money was. And we did a lot of this in the Cold War era, when some countries were almost pretending to be leaning communist so they get more help from us. This is, as Walter Jones mentioned, a lot of our constituents are worried about foreign aid, and they're particularly worried about military aid that really ends up being foreign aid and that produces no real result. But another aspect of this security cooperation that worries me is it tends to be incumbent protection, because almost by definition, you talk to host militaries. Those are the folks in power. And General Frasier was kind enough to acknowledge that this cannot stop political change within the country, but sometimes it can certainly inhibit it. And money is fungible, and you really don't know where, if you free up resources in the host nation, where those could be put. And some host militaries are so embedded in the economy, like, for example, the Egyptian military, that it's kind of an amazing thing when they own appliance companies in Egypt and divert resources that way, and yet we're helping them with tactics, techniques, and procedures. So to me, in your analysis, it would be more accurate, and I'm not the expert, y'all are, if you focused on the quantum difference in resources and also the incumbent protection nature of this. Almost by definition, you have to go with the host nation's incumbent military. And that puts a real bias in the process. And we're not even talking about upholding lines drawn primarily by the British Empire on the map in many regions of the world that have almost nothing to do with ethnicity or tribe or current conditions. So as I've stated many times before, we're almost executors of the British estate here as we unthinkingly, enforce those lines on maps. When maybe they make sense, maybe they don't, but we just seem to automatically pump big dollars into incumbent governments, and we call it security assistance, and that does relieve us often of the obligation of putting U.S. troops in more directly, and we want friendships and partnerships. But sometimes we care more about these nations than even their host governments. To what extent do we monitor kleptocracy?
Congressman, let me attempt to answer it a little bit, and that is, but I'm going to talk specifically from a military perspective, not from a political perspective, because we are supporting those militaries, if you will, that are in existence. From supporting the incumbents, at least from a military perspective, my experience has been is it has not protected the military leadership. I've seen lots of military leadership changed, and there hasn't been a change in that country, and there hasn't been a change within that military. From a political standpoint, I think it varies country by country what impact that may or may not have. Now, speaking from a military standpoint, with some of my counterparts, they would come to the United States looking for assistance that they were either unable to or unwilling to go to their own government to seek for assistance. And so that's one that we have to always be watchful for and understand when it's happening. And one of the things from a military standpoint, and I would argue from a U.S. in a lot of cases, we tend to mirror image our perspective on other governments and other cultures. And we need to do a better job of understanding what's important within that culture and what means something as we develop these programs.
I agree, General. We should never mirror image. When I was last in Bogota, I asked where the wealthy part of town was. And I was told by our folks that, oh, the wealthiest Colombians, they all live in New York and Miami. What's going on here? They have to care as much about their country as we do.
Again, I don't want to speak for the Colombians Congressman, but I would argue that if you look back over the last 15 years, Colombians have owned their problem. The Colombians instigated a war tax. That tax was focused on the wealthy. The wealthy stood behind it. And that's a large measure of why the Colombians have been successful, is because they paid for it. The United States has encouraged other countries within Central America to follow that model to finance the needs for their own security.
General, my information may be dated, but when I visited Colombia, it had the highest income inequality in the world.
Yes, sir, it still does.
Mr. Nugent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank this panel for being here today. I'm sorry I missed your opening remarks, but I had another committee assignment that I had to take. You know, it's striking, though. I was in Afghanistan in 2011, and with a bunch of Marines, and we went to a location that they took back from those that were fighting us in Afghanistan, rebuilt a school, not like schools that we know of. Obviously, you've been there. But what was striking is the Marines at the time were paying the headmaster to teach. I mean, they were paying his salary. But what changed was, you know, as we wanted to get out of Afghanistan, we were pushing more of it on the central government to take care of that particular issue, even though it was our foreign dollars, our foreign aid going to do that. But the headmaster wasn't getting paid, you know, for months at a time at that point. And, you know, he risked his life. School was burnt down. He was chased, risked his life to come back to train the Afghanis, school children, girls and boys for the first time. But when I asked the State Department, you know, what are we doing on checks and balances? I mean, you were out here. Why wouldn't we make sure this guy gets paid? If the Marines were paying him at one point in time, now we're giving the money directly to the central government. We know it's not getting him. And I guess what I'm hearing from you is that they're under-resourced to do it, but it was a real flippant response from State Department in regards to, well, that's not our problem. But it is our dollars. And so I guess in our rush sometimes to leave a country, and I get it, I got 3 kids in the Army that have been, you know, in those great places like Afghanistan, Iraq. But if we're putting our dollars there in foreign aid, how do we make sure that those dollars are being spent correctly? And I know that's really not the discussion here, but it is because, you know, the military general, from your aspect, obviously that was important to stabilize a country. But when do we rush into it, and, you know, when do we draw the line and say, listen, yes, I know we want to get this government up and running, but maybe they're not ready yet to do it with our dollars? Do we ever make that decision and say, hey, listen, no, we shouldn't do that? Does the State Department ever do that? Are you aware of?
Sure. I mean, as it related to the CSTICA and the NATO training mission,
Right.
I can explain at least what they try to do, because the corruption in Afghanistan is very well documented. There's no modern banking system. And so at least when it went to, because U.S. taxpayers pay the salaries of Afghan military and police. And so what CSTICA did, I don't know if it's still active, but tried to set up an electronic pay system with an ATM card, but this is where the illiteracy challenge came in.
Right.
As well as do regular census to monitor to make sure there weren't kind of ghost Tashkil, kind of ghost muster sheets to make sure individuals were getting paid who actually existed. But many challenges, without a doubt. And I think in Afghanistan, it's probably the hardest problem because the civil war devastated society and the economy. And my own opinion, without the $4.5 billion or so that the U.S. taxpayers provide, the system would collapse.
If I may, I have a couple thoughts about this as well. One of the things I mentioned in my opening remarks was the importance of flexibility. Sometimes we unfortunately encounter a situation where we begin security cooperation with a partner, it's authorized and funded, and delivery begins, and then some level in the partner hierarchy becomes reticent and stops cooperating. And unfortunately, often the executors on the U.S. side don't have the authority to turn the tap on and off. And so how do you incentivize a partner to resume cooperation when deliveries are still being...
And I think that was, and you probably answered a question I didn't really lay out clearly, but you're answering the question is once we get on a track, do we ever reel it back? Do we ever, like you say, turn off the tap and say, hold on a second, you're not meeting the goals? And you talk about, you know, goals and coming in and looking at a program to see if it's actually doing what it's supposed to do. That should be one of those. And I would think it would give the commander on the ground a whole lot more responsibility, because I know that the Marine major that was there, he was frustrated because it didn't seem like anybody was listening to him, and he's out there with these guys every day. So how do we do that? How do we give them the flexibility to turn the tap off?
I'm not sure in process exactly what has to happen, but I think some of it has to be at the level of authorities, and then some of it has to be in their bureaucracy. Sometimes that authority is held somewhere in their bureaucracy, but the major on the ground in some province doesn't know who to talk to make that happen. I think there is periodic reviews of these programs, but usually that's on an annual or semi-annual basis. And so, again, within a push for assessment and increased flexibility in the authorities should help, because that is a real problem, sir.
General.
If I can add in one thing, I think, one, you have to have clearly defined objectives with very clearly defined metrics that you measure and then decide. But I also think not only an authority's part to this, but sometimes, at least within the Department of Defense, if you give money back or you hold money, then somebody else takes it. And so there has to be an incentive within the organization that I can make smart decisions, and that money can be, I can apply that money to other places without a large effort to try and make that happen. That I have the flexibility, as Dr. Paul says, to be able to move those funds to where they're going to have the biggest impact, and I can then stay. And then I need to be accountable for those decisions.
Right. Well, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me a little extra time. Thank you, and I appreciate your comments.
Thank you. Ms. Bordeo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing. To some degree, you all mentioned the need for enduring relationships with partners that are actively looking for our cooperation, but not one of you mention one example of a successful program that accomplishes this goal. And it's the National Guard's State Partnership Program that does an outstanding job at creating long-term relationships with countries and results in increased capabilities for the nations that take part. The Guard provides unique capacity building capabilities to combatant commanders and U.S. ambassadors via 68 comprehensive partnerships between the National Guard units across the United States and, gentlemen, 74 partner nations, with more being developed. Now, this program has been operating for more than 20 years, and I will be working to enhance the program. I'd like to highlight one partnership in particular, the partnership between the California National Guard and Ukraine. When conflict began in Ukraine, it was that relationship that gave us some of our best insight into what was actually happening on the ground, thanks to the long-term and often personal relationships that had developed. Not only did this put the Ukrainian military in a better position to respond, but it also gave us access that would have been very difficult to obtain in any other way. Now, my question is, how do you see the National Guard contributing to security cooperation in the future? Can any of you comment on the value of the State Partnership Program and how we can enhance it, or other programs that develop these long-term relationships? Now, I realize, gentlemen, that most of our security cooperative programs aim to address counterterrorism. So how can we shape these programs to be broader in scope, like the Guard program? And I'd like to ask each one of you.
Ma'am, let me start, if I may. You're exactly right. The National Guard programs are critical tools for every combatant commander, and they make a big difference. One example, when I was assigned in Alaska, the Alaska Guard had a relationship with Mongolia. When the president of Mongolia visited the United States, one of his stops was to visit the adjutant general in Alaska before he went back to Mongolia, because the relationship was as close. So it's a critical tool, and we need to continue to use it. We also, as well as building capacity, there's a lot of effort that goes into training and exercising with partner nations. And that's really that relationship that continues to grow. So those opportunities where we have to do that, I think, will help build the capacity. Where there are opportunities to support their ability to do disaster response and to help support disaster response training and efforts within differing nations, I think that is a real strength that the Guard brings to any relationship that we have. And then just the overall relationship that they bring into our military departments also is beneficial. So from my standpoint, we always looked to as much of the Guard participation as they could afford.
Dr. Paul?
Thank you. The state partnership program is a great program, and it's very cost effective because it doesn't require that much additional resourcing with potentially modest payouts. And I think that's a kind of program that often gets overlooked or can be in danger in times of austerity. A program that doesn't cost a great deal, but doesn't have gigantic payouts. Many of the payouts are fairly modest, but important, especially in long-term relationships. And that's something that, as we think about assessment, that we have to keep in mind. Every mission has a primary mission that should be spelled out very clearly, but there may be other forms of ancillary benefit. So usually the primary mission of a National Guard engagement is to do some kind of building partner capacity exercise or some kind of interoperability exercise. But the ancillary benefit is the relationship, and those relationships can be hugely important, like the instance you mentioned with Ukraine and in other countries where there is turmoil. And someone from the United States who's still in uniform can call up someone in the partner nation who's still in uniform and ask what is going on, and open a dialogue in that way.
Dr. Revon?
No, thank you very much for the question, and it's a brilliant insight. And because I think security cooperation really works best building these long-term relationships, and the Guard is really suited for that because members of the Guard don't rotate as frequently as they do on active duty. And so if you're in the California Guard, you tend to stay in the California Guard, and you can keep going back to that country year after year in all the different positions. So I think the SPP, you're absolutely right, ma'am. It's a fantastic program to develop these relationships.
Well, I thank you very much for your comments to my question. I just wish it would mentioned in your opening statements. Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. Members of this committee understand that security cooperation has long been a component of our national security strategy, and it has become more of a central figure over the last decade. My question is a broad one, but I wanted to get each of you on the record. Can security cooperation be a substitute for U.S. forces? And the reason I'm asking that question is I'm concerned that some may assume that security cooperation can replace U.S. forces as a justification for the further drawdown. So I'd like you to each comment on whether it can be a substitute. I'll start with you, General Frasier.
I would tell you that a lot of our security cooperation programs exist today because of the size of our force, and that it's an ancillary part to our ability to train and exercise and provide capacity and work with other countries. Drawdown in the size of our forces would mean that we'd have less opportunity to train with our partners because we'd be focused on maintaining our own readiness, and we'd have smaller capacity to be able to do that.
Dr. Paul?
I think the idea of security cooperation is to lighten the load on our military forces and to decrease the frequency with which we have to deploy them in order to help other countries and other parts of the world help themselves. That said, I don't think there's any danger of disbanding the Marine Corps in favor of the Peace Corps.
So just to get it on record, security cooperation is not a substitute for U.S. forces?
Correct.
Yes?
No, and I would add, and I would say, in fact, it probably enhances U.S. Power in general. And so, for example, we're very concerned about civil war in Somalia, don't want to put U.S. Boots on ground in Somalia, but by training and equipping Ethiopians, Kenyans, Burundians, and others, they can provide that force, and then the U.S. incurs that benefit of stability, an attempt of stability in Somalia.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panelists. Dr. Paul, you said in your comments, and I paraphrase them, we can't want it more than they want it. And in some respects, I think we suffer from superimposing what we believe they want or convincing the leadership that it's what they want when it's not what the people want. The revelation that in Syria, after all the money we spent, $500 million, we have 4 or 5 individuals who have been trained and equipped is more than an embarrassment. And had that not become public at a Senate hearing, I think we would be moving forward, spending more money. How do we put in place some form of governance of these efforts, excuse me, so that when they are failing, we just fess up to it and pull that plug?
Ma'am, I view that as an assessment question. That's part of assessment. Are you, so I don't know anything more about the Syrian program than what's been discussed in the popular press. It's not an area of personal expertise, but thinking in general about these kinds of efforts, if there was assessment in place, clearly when you get to the point of measuring your measures of performance, is money being spent on what? What are you delivering? Well, we only have 5 trainees. That's got to be a concern, and there's got to be internal revisions to the program. There has to be a feedback loop, and then when you come to the output is number of trained personnel produced, 5. That's got to be well below the target, and there has to be accountability for that.
Well, yes, there should be accountability, but to just say we're going to put an assessment tool, supposedly we have persons in authority that can make that assessment and should be making that assessment without the benefit of an assessment tool. I mean,
no, fair enough. That one is so clearly and obviously not successful that it shouldn't require much of an assessment framework. But if there were an assessment framework and assessment mindedness in place, that call would get made earlier. And the whole benefit of assessment is, what can we learn from this? Why did this program go awry? How were we allowed to spend so much money over so much time without recognizing that things could be different and what could be different, so that the next time we do this, it doesn't happen that way?
so General Fraser, with our pivot to the Pacific, what or should there be efforts undertaken to improve our military relationship with China and create greater predictability in the South China Sea?
I think there is, and there's ongoing effort, at least from what I understand, again from press, that there is an ongoing effort on the part of the Pacific Command as well as U.S. military to build those relationships. But we have to also remember that relationships are two-way streets. And so there has to be the same willingness and the same openness and the same ability on the part of whomever we're building that relationship with. But we find across, at least my experience, that the more we're able to understand one another, we may not agree with one another, but the more we can work and at least know what my counterparts' views are, that's important. So yes, I think we should continue our efforts.
And is there anything else you think we should be doing that we're not doing?
I think it is a slow process. It is a step-by-step process, and we just need to work our way down that path. And it's going to take, in my opinion, a long time.
For all of you, are there any examples that you can give us of security cooperation in non-defense sectors that have been successful? Silence is golden, I guess.
I'm not quite sure I completely understand the question.
Well, we're providing training and equipping But we're also doing things in other nations that are non-security related that you could argue are creating security cooperation. Can you point to any of those that are non-defense related that have paid back in dividends?
Ma'am, the one I'll use is really focused on the Department of Justice, if you will, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and a lot of the work that they do within Latin America and within counter-drug operations all over. I think if you go in and look at some of the international narcotics and logistics out of the Department of State that also fund similar types of programs, those are very helpful. But there is a close relationship, and I'll use the effort, the counter-drug effort within the Caribbean led by JIADF South. A lot of the intelligence that they get comes out of law enforcement organizations and relationships. Then it moves into a military sphere, if you can, for an intercept. But once that intercept's taking place, then it is law enforcement who is then engaged again so that there's a legal procedure that continues from that, and then it goes into the court system from there. So that's a lot of different agencies who have found the ability to work together, and I think that's the real model as we look at it, is we shouldn't try and divorce any of these programs from one another. They work best when they work together.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Rourke. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on some questions that have been asked about tough decisions that we have to make when our short-term security interests or those of our partners conflict with longer-term strategic interests, or even just the standing of the United States in a given part of the world. The example of Egypt was used earlier, where there is a prohibition on the kind of military assistance we've given that regime, the current regime, if it is a regime that's in place due to a coup. And we have essentially looked the other way because of very real short-term immediate problems. ISIS, I think, was one of the reasons given for contravening that part of U.S. law or policy. To move back to this hemisphere, you can use the example of Guatemala in the 50s or Chile in the 1970s, El Salvador, Nicaragua in the 1980s, to see where that short-term focus has caused us long-term problems, and probably more importantly caused the people in those countries significant suffering and long-term harm. Tell me, and I'll start with General Frasier, your thoughts on the administration's recent decision to withhold 15% of Merida funding to Mexico because of human rights concerns. I know that's not strictly military aid, but it's connected to military aid that we've given that country. Is that a step in the right direction to begin to hold regimes accountable for things like human rights and their conduct using the money that U.S. taxpayers have supplied?
Congressman, thank you for that question. I think that, and there's been a big focus, at least in my time in Southern Command. I know General Kelly continues it and has actually expanded the program on the focus on human rights and the importance of militaries sustaining their focus on human rights. But as you say, there are very hard decisions that have to be made as we go through and look at what the results are. So I will argue that we need to have a very clear focus there as well, and determine what we're trying to achieve and measure how we are able to do that. It's a situation that will always be troublesome as we go through it, and I don't know all the specifics around the specifics of the Merida, but I know that there's a lot of focus and effort that the armed forces put in to vetting organizations with whom they work for, with abiding by human rights vetting, and then supporting those organizations that we should. And in fact, the example I'll use is during my time in Southern Command, we had a problem where one of the countries decided to shoot down airplanes, and we had to stop aid going into them very specifically for that reason. But on the other side of that, the current militaries, I have a hard time, if they have not had any human rights violations in 20 years, that we hold them accountable for what happened 20 years ago. There's somewhere in there has to be a balance.
Yeah, and I don't know if other members of the panel would like to address this issue of how we balance what we stand for to ourselves and much of the rest of the world. You know, democracy and freedom and human rights with some of the regimes and non-regime actors that we support who don't help us to achieve those things for the people in those countries. And does that diminish our standing in those regions, in those countries, and is it counterproductive ultimately?
It's definitely an issue, because as you've highlighted, we often have conflicting objectives. We have a short-term objective that's about improving the security situation or improving the capability of partner forces. But we have long-term objectives that have to do with our national values, things about human rights, things about democracy and other kinds of issues. So I think we have to recognize that sometimes these objectives are in conflict, and there has to be some prioritization. From some of the cases I've examined over 20-year periods, we find that, yes, if there's a suspension of the relationship due to human rights violations, that does unsurprisingly impair our ability to build partner capacity. But pleasantly, in most of those cases, it's also caused the partner to improve their behavior.
No, and maybe to add, I share your concern, because while we might not have a deep appreciation for history, our partners certainly do. And we have to be very careful in protecting, you know, what the United States holds dear. And because we have a very non-exclusive list of partners, I really think what we need to make sure is that when we inculcate with these programs, that we're doing it in accordance with American values. And I think the officers that at least I teach understand that, and I think programs like Leahy vetting ensure that we identify that. But there are long-term consequences, because our history shows we will support a wrong side. A U.S. graduate of an IMET program will stage a coup. That happens, as you know, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me zoom back out for just a second. It kind of goes back to some things Ms. Stefanik was talking with you all about. I mean, my assumption is we can't do everything in the world, so we have to have some partners of different capabilities. Some are sophisticated like NATO countries, some are lesser developed sorts of countries. So if you had to give a grade for our security cooperation efforts, how are we doing? When you look at this range, you know, which is us and the Brits and the Australians at one level, and, you know, a few advisors we're sending to Cameroon on the other, or, you know, or wherever at that level. How are we doing?
I'll take a stab, sir. In our study, we looked at 29 cases. In 23 of those 29, we evaluated there being some level of success in building partner capacity. So if we use a conventional American high school grading system, 23 out of 29 probably comes in the B range.
Okay, y'all agree?
Yes, sir. I mean, I think one of the things I look for is we empower our partners, and so it's everything from a country like Japan that not only wants to buy our weapons but operate with us but provide us host nation support, but also countries like Ethiopia that's willing to deploy into Somalia.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with the B rating. I think as you look at, focus it specifically on relationship building, I think we're probably in a B plus, maybe a low A, but as you look at it from a capability standpoint, I would argue we're probably down in the C range, maybe a little bit lower than that, because that's a harder issue to take on. It requires a lot more focus and a lot more discipline and a lot more patience, if you will, than just the building relationship part of this.
Yeah, well, I made note of your comments, General, on strategic patience, because that is not a quality with which we are always associated in this country. So let's just think for a second, because a lot of attention recently has been on our disappointment at the Afghan forces not advancing faster, although they've made tremendous strides. But disappointment, they haven't advanced faster. The Iraqis, it didn't work out very well when ISIS confronted them, and then as Ms. Spear was talking about the Syria thing. From those examples of trying to train and equip security forces in the Middle East and South Asia, without asking y'all to be experts on any particular case, do you think there are lessons to be learned from those disappointing results?
I can highlight two lessons just off the top of my head. First is about whether the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. Afghan security forces have made remarkable strides from their baseline state. Arguably, Iraqi forces made pretty impressive stride from their baseline state. The question is then, are they good enough to face the threat that they face? And the answer in both cases is equivocal. The other key issue is about willingness to fight. This is an incredibly difficult thing to assess. It's incredibly difficult to know how willing to fight a force is until they are battle tested.
Okay.
If I can add, sir, 100,000 U.S. troops didn't defeat the Taliban, so I'm not completely surprised that the Afghan forces we trained and equipped didn't either, haven't either, and struggled as well. Maybe the general lesson for me is military cannot solve a political problem, and so unless there is a legitimate, semi-stable political authority that can control a border and actually run a government, efforts to reinforce another country's military are going to have limited success.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, what I would say is I think there are important lessons that we can take from all three, and I'm not an expert on any one of them. But I will capsulize it in that the three areas that we're talking about were all combat zones, and they were all security cooperation being conducted in combat and in a combat zone. And that differs, I would argue, from the security cooperation programs that we have other places. And I would argue that it's much more difficult because the security situation is much more different. The security that the people feel is much different. The relationships, the political relationships, are much more tenuous than they can be in other situations. So I think we really need to take a hard look at it from that standpoint and not just capture all security cooperation in one bucket.
Well, in general, the Congressional Research Service work looking at a variety of test cases makes that exact point. The thing that we have the hardest time with is doing this sort of thing in war zones, because obviously you got a war to fight while you're also building the capability. It's just hard. So I appreciate that. Y'all talked a lot today about Colombia. Are there other examples of successes that you think deserve our attention? Various things I've read mention the Philippines as having some success. You know, are there other examples?
No, I think my favorite example is really South Korea, because if you look at it over that 60-year period, you see what the country, government, military have really become, and it's still very capable. Other examples, Israel. We don't really discuss Israel as a case of security cooperation, but if you look at from a funding perspective, it clearly is. And in that case, the U.S. benefits tremendously from the relationship because there are common areas of technology transfer. And then on other examples, I would look to the peacekeeping programs funded under the Global Peacekeeping Operations Initiative, you know, in particular, Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya.
I'll toss Jordan onto the pile. This is an example of a country where we've invested a great deal with a great level of success, so much so that they've become a regional center for training peacekeeping forces. So it's a pay-it-forward security cooperation model and a success in that regard.
The only thing I'll add, Mr. Chairman, is I think the Philippines is a good example also. But I think it's important in this equation also as we look at those successes is to put the political dimension into this, to just apply a security cooperation program and expect it to achieve the results without having a companion political effort to get a political decision to follow that same path and follow that success, we're misaligned. And so I think we have to follow it in a holistic approach.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I appreciate all those examples. I don't know, it seems to me the challenge is, okay, what if you're in a messy place without a strong political infrastructure to work with? I'm thinking of Mali, for example. We spent a fair amount of time trying to develop security forces there. It didn't work very well. And so the question for us is, do we not engage if there's not a strong political infrastructure, you know, with which to work? Do we engage with much lower expectations of what can result in it? I don't know the answers. I guess I'm morally thinking out loud here. But I was listening as y'all were talking with Mr. Smith and others about the importance of development assistance, the importance of the political engagement, the inadequacies of the State Department, the need for strategic patience. You know, it is true. We need to know what works. And then the hard question is, okay, if you don't have all those things, do you engage anyway? And you know, I guess maybe that's a case-by-case sort of situation. Y'all don't have to comment on that, but you're welcome to if you want.
It seems to me that you've identified the right issues, that it is a challenge, and that expectation management is key. And so the decision should be made in each of those instances based on realistic expectations. Another observation from some of our research that might be relevant is the value of ministerial capacity building. So in a situation where you lack a lot of the contextual factors that make security cooperation more likely to be successful, some of the political support, baseline absorptive capacity, well, investing in ministerial capacity can both help improve future absorptive capacity if you have strategic patience, and is investing in the government, albeit through the defense ministry, and can make that more robust.
Yeah.
And in fact, we noted a number of cases where we were able to successfully contribute to ministerial capacity building, and then later on, historically later, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, be able to start building actual forces capability.
Okay, let me touch on just one, maybe two other things right quick. Now I want to yield to Mr. Franks. Dr. Paul, in your testimony, you talked about authorities and basically said we need more flexibility, that we get kind of wrapped around. CRS says we have 80 different authorities in DOD, and that doesn't even include the State Department authorities. We get wrapped around that. What wasn't clear to me from your testimony is how big a problem this is. How much of a problem is caused by having all of these different complex authorities and sign-offs and so forth?
I actually think General Frasier may be able to speak to this better because of his experience, but I'll say from what I know, talking to operators, doing interviews, looking at the histories, it's a problem in concert with other problems. So there is what's described in the community as a patchwork of authorities. There are a lot of different authorities to do a lot of different things, and if you're an experienced and practiced bureaucrat and invest a lot of time into it, it's amazing the kinds of things you can pull together to get stuff done. Unfortunately, we have a rotational culture on both the military and the civilian side. So someone who has had a prior security cooperation billet and falls in on a very well orchestrated set of programs may be able to make that transition and get things to go smoothly. But if someone new rotates in and has transferred from some other aspect of the service and doesn't have any experience there, and there isn't a good transition folder, and there's changing needs in that country, they may well be quickly overwhelmed.
Sir, my perspective is, in a lot of cases, I would argue people trying to manage their way through the authorities results in how are we going to do this to get a little bit of something done rather than what we need to have done. So they're just trying to help. They're trying to align with our partner's requests, but it's very hard when a partner says this, but my authority will only let me do a very small part of what you're asking to be able to do this. And it's all normally the authorities that we get placed on in various different places, I would argue, come from individual instances where we need an authority to go do something for some limited amount of time, and then they either sustain themselves or they get patchworked in another way. My thoughts are, for security cooperation to be successful, security assistance, we need to have a longer range strategic objective. And then I'm a believer in, and then build the authorities to help achieve that objective rather than the patchwork that I have to manage along with all the other pieces to go out to achieve that goal.
Okay, well, we've talked about lots of things today, some of which is in the purview of Congress, some of which is not. This is ours. We can make this better, and I'm just trying to figure out if it's worth the effort. How much of a benefit comes from it, I guess I should say. Let me yield to Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you. I'll try to just keep this to one general question because I think it goes to the core of what we're all talking about, and I'm sure you've already touched on it substantively prior to that. But I mean, it's a very compelling concept, this building partnership capacity, because we're able to kind of lighten our load and try to bring in new friends. There's something very compelling about that. But of course, sometimes we succeed pretty effectively, like we have with Israel and the Iron Dome and missile batteries. Those have been marked successes, and then sometimes we don't do so well, like training and equipping the program in Syria. And so it seems to me that the key here is to ascertain ways that we can make sure that those we're dealing with are the right ones that we should be dealing with. And I would look to you to tell us, what metric do you use to ascertain what you think has been a successful effort, and how should Congress measure that in our oversight capacity? And General Frasier, I'll start with you, and thank you for your service here.
Thank you, sir. I guess I'm struggling a little bit with how we put this together. I guess to be successful in my mind, it has to be a two-way street. And a lot of times I think we go into this and we have a capability. We think, and it's in our interest to help build your capacity in this way, but that partner may not see it exactly that same way. So we have to have a two-way conversation that matches and makes our goals match. And then I would argue, then we have to stay very, very focused on whether or not we're doing that through good assessment and metrics. But I would also argue, much as we rotate through a lot of people, our partners also rotate. And so sometimes when one senior leader in a government changes or in a military changes to another, the successor doesn't always agree with the program that was put in place, but we continue that program along. So we got to have another agreement every time leadership changes, I would argue, to help us be successful. And then put small goals, achievable goals in a timely time frame that will then build on one another, rather than say that we've got to have the whole enchilada tomorrow.
Sir, I believe that both of your questions about how do we deal with the right partner and how do we assess success hinge on objectives and interests. If we're clear about what our objectives are and what our interests are, then that can allow us to examine a potential partner or a partner that we're considering changing our relationship with, and see whether our objectives align with their objectives so that we have shared interests, and how much distance there is between their baseline condition and where we want them to be and what we want them to do to meet our objectives. And then for assessment, how, again, the clarity of our objectives and the distance between where you start and where you're going to end up. Because I'm aware of a lot of cases where security cooperation objectives were met. We dramatically improved the capability of a partner, but national security objectives were not met because that partner was not, at the end of the day, sufficiently robust to deal with whatever the threat or the challenge was by themselves.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity, and I'll yield back right there. Thank you.
Mr. O'Rourke, you have further questions?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on a question that the ranking member asked about whether it is helpful to put some kind of absolute cap or horizon on aid to reduce the risk of a moral hazard. In other words, We don't want the partner country to think that U.S. assistance is going to be there no matter what, because then they will fail to develop the capacity and capabilities that are necessary for them to be able to take on their challenges without U.S. aid in the future. Is that in fact the right approach? And Colombia was mentioned as an example of that. Are there other examples where we've set some kind of fixed amount of U.S. intervention or aid or a date certain that has been effective?
You're absolutely right. I mean, there's a moral hazard in all of these, and the easiest example, you look at NATO spending. NATO sets the target of 2% of GDP on defense. I think it's only 4 of the 28 make it, and there is that tendency.
They know the United States will be there.
No, absolutely. But I would also say too is I'm concerned if we get too narrowly focused on achievable objectives. You know, sometimes we give assistance because we gain base access. Sometimes we give assistance because we would joke, 50 flags over ISAF in Kabul. We got legitimacy, you know, on that. And even you got a little moral upbringing when you saw the Bosnian flag flying, because 20 years earlier, we were dealing with the ethnic conflict in Bosnia. And so I appreciate the concern and the question, and I think it's always there. And that's where I think really at the U.S. Embassy level in those countries really have a better feel for it. To capture some of the subjectivity that's involved in providing these programs.
And I think you could argue the other side and use Iraq and Afghanistan as examples where you set a fixed deadline, I think with the intention of forcing that partner country to step up and recognize that at some point they're going to have to take these issues into their own hands. Seems in Iraq not to have worked, certainly. And in Afghanistan, the president has changed course and recommitted the current force size until conditions on the ground change. So would you argue that it's a case-by-case, condition-by-condition issue, and that it is not helpful then to set a deadline, or is there some other way to resolve the potential for a moral hazard and perpetual U.S. presence?
My answer directly is it depends. I just don't think there is one standard that fits every situation. And I would argue that that when you get into security cooperation, when you get into especially combat zones, those are morally hazardous zones. And there's no way to whether a number of troops or a standard or anything like that will avoid the fact that there are going to be some conflicts there. And so from my standpoint, we need to realize that, we need to accept that, and then we need to understand where interests and those moral hazards come in conflict with one another and make very clear decisions on which way we need to go. But bottom line to it is, it depends.
I'll echo and agree with it depends, but it should be a consideration. As we're laying out our investment and our plan for engagement in a country, as I said earlier, you can't want it more than they do. And if you're in a situation where there is moral hazard, where there's some danger of us wanting it more than they do, then it's critical that we identify the right levers in order to retain some kind of leverage over the partner so that we can influence them, so we can say, well, you need to achieve this benchmark by this date, or there will be a consequence, and then we need to be willing to put those consequences in place, whether it's specific drawdowns of forces or changes in resource allocation or things like that.
Yeah, I think because this is so hard and the consequences are so significant, I'm looking for some certain rules of the road, kind of like we have on the military intervention side, the Powell Doctrine. You know, these 8 preconditions must exist before you commit U.S. forces. I think you're saying that it's not going to be that easy, and you cannot simplify it to that degree, and it's going to be on a condition-by-condition basis. Although I think you've given us some really important principles, like you can't solve a political problem militarily. And you've mentioned the need to resource and staff the State Department side of this, so you have the corresponding diplomatic and political aspect covered, and I think that's helpful. If would look forward to anything additional you can point me and other members towards that would help us to make better decisions as a country going forward. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add one thing here. I think the real focus as you talk about this, because we're really talking about moral judgment, and we're talking about individuals having moral judgment in horrific circumstances. Education is the focus. We have to build the capacity of military personnel on both sides, or whoever we're working with, to be able to have that moral judgment that will meet international standards. And absent that, then it's a crapshoot.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to get to that in just a second. Ms. Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It goes along with this, but it's sort of the leverage that we have and whether we use it or we don't, conditionality. I think these are things that the public responds to, and often I hear from people that feel like, we don't use it when we should. The example of Mexico recently is one, obviously Pakistan, another where the Congress has weighed in, and we're probably out of town now, but I just, trying to sort of wade through that, sometimes muck, is really difficult. And in general, maybe you've had, an example of where you wanted to use it, weren't able to use it. What was at stake there? What was occurring that?
Well, a lot of the zones, topics we're talking about are combat zones, but there have been examples where, and I'll just air my frustration, we've had very strict rules on what we can and can't do with certain armed forces. And those are valid. But my concern has been to put a benchmark on what's that mean, and what's that mean for current day leaders vice something that happened in the past. And when is good enough good enough? Because in some cases, good enough, a government took seriously what we were talking about. They made positive steps, and we changed the conditions. That shouldn't stand either. So we have to do some of our own understanding of what do we really want, what do we really expect as you look at it in combination with our other interests. As that understanding and that conditionality, if you will, it needs to be there. But it's got to be put in the bigger context and not just something as a whole from my standpoint.
Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. Obviously, in every situation, it's going to be different. And, we're going to set an objective, and then we have to look at the pieces on the chessboard, if you will. Where is this country now? For example, in Iraq, should we have kept the military in place and started from there? Those types of discussions probably should take place long before we act and intervene and get into place. And I would agree with you wholeheartedly. There's a big difference between trying to prop up a military in the middle of a war and create a new military in the middle of a war, and that's a greater challenge. One of the things you mentioned today, well, a couple things. One, it comes down to dollars, will, and politics, I think, in a lot of cases, right? And to that point of will, I just have one question. I should know the answer to this. In Afghanistan today, are they operating under a draft, or are they volunteer military?
It's an all-volunteer force, sir.
Okay. Well, that says a lot to their will, I would say, and we do hear more positive things about their will as opposed to other places. But that's really all I have. Thank you very much for being here today.
Let me just get to one other thing. General Frasier, you've talked about the rotational culture and the need for us to be better trained at training, if it will. And so one of the questions I've had is, how do y'all evaluate our institutions, our organizations, for engaging with other countries? There have been suggestions, for example, that we need to form different organizations within the military who specialize in this. Of course, Special Forces, it's always been a key capability of theirs, but just give me, if you will, y'all's evaluation of how well prepared we are for the various sorts of things we've been talking about today.
Congressman, or Mr. Chairman, let me start with that. In a lot of cases, I think where we are not as prepared as I would like to see us is in our understanding of whatever culture and whatever military we're working with. I just don't think we're very good at that, and even with those officers and enlisted personnel that we train and who are embedded and really study those environments. They don't always understand the military organizations and what really drives some of the military organizations. For example, some of them in Latin America, we say, okay, they're committed to this program as we are. And what we find out in some cases, well, no, in one case, 90% of an organization, of an army, was committed to helping private security because they don't get very much money from their government for this. So this was a way for them to help build up the capacity of their armed forces. We don't understand that relationship and that intricacy a lot of times. And so from that standpoint, we need to be able to do better than that. But that's an ongoing issue, and that's a rotational issue. We're always going to have a problem with the expertise there because people cap out at a certain level within our armed forces, normally who are in security assistance and security cooperation. And they have to have a skill set to just be knowledgeable of another country's culture and how they operate. When you're trying to build a military capacity, is you need to have some military expertise also, and you have to build that somewhere. That has to happen within our organization. But I think what the Marines are doing today was designating special purpose MAGTAFs on a regional basis. The Army is doing the same thing with brigades. The Navy, I would argue, in some cases routinely does that, in a lot of cases better. I think that's a good step in the right direction, and that brings that combat expertise in our relationships, and that's valued by our partners.
And Mr. Chairman, so at the Naval War College, for example, our intermediate course for 03s and 04s, it's regional focused. And so we divide the students by region, and then we give them sort of the problem over the term. How do you translate national strategy into regional strategy? And that's an attempt to kind of get at the broad base. I think within the force, the FAO program, Foreign Area Officer Program, is the gold standard. And then you see these different programs that have popped up over time, the AFPAC hands, for example, or I think the Navy has the Asia-Pacific hands. And those have limited life because we're a global force and you never quite know where the next resource is. So, or I would argue then for, across the entire force, more programs that really emphasize a study of other regions, cultures, and histories. And you see the Army, too, the designated, the regional aligned force concept, I think is another way to get at that.
I concur with all of those remarks, and I'll note that we're really good at training ourselves. We habitually take men and women from civilian life and inculcate them into a highly effective military and build our own capabilities quite well. We're really good at working with partners who are very much like us, with our NATO partners. The interoperability exercises we do with them are great. Where we struggle is in different contexts. We're too vulnerable to mirror imaging, and we don't have enough of a mindset of recognizing the kinds of things that can be different and how that can impact outcomes.
Okay, well that's helpful. This is a complex area, and yet, as people have said, it's a central part of our security. So thank y'all for helping to enlighten us and think through some of these issues. We may well draw on you again in the future. Again, we appreciate your testimony. With that, the hearing stands adjourned.